Good morning. I'm Joe Head, the Vice President of the Etowah Valley Historical Society, and it is October the 21st, 2021, and we are here at the Archer and Lovell Law Offices in Cartersville on Irwin Street. And today we're going to discuss the history of Ladd's Mountain. And we're very fortunate to have some professional and local historians with us that will be interviewed, and I'd like to introduce them at this time. We have first with us David Archer at the end of the table at the law offices here, and local historian as well, and Scott Keith with Southern Research, and who has been to this county many times and has conducted surveys and archaeology studies and written for us here with the Etowah Valley Historical Society. And then we also have Carl Etheridge, who is a former president of EVHS and retired from the Corps of Engineers, and has also been noted to be a local archaeologist and amateur historian and a resource for us here in Bartow County. So I'd like to begin. We want to talk about the history of one of our natural wonders here in Bartow County, and that being Ladd's Mountain. And Ladd's Mountain is one of actually three magnificent natural wonders that we have. We have Saltpeter Cave, and we have the Etowah River. And people don't realize it, but we have 38 caves that have existed at one time, still exist here in Bartow County. And Ladd's Mountain has had a number of caves at one time. Some are not there any longer. But I'd like to begin at this time and just talk with our guests here about the ancient history of Ladd's Mountain. Many people don't realize how valuable that has been to the Native Americans and the Mississippian occupation here. I'd like to begin with Scott. And Scott, if you would, tell us something about the background of Ladd's Mountain, and particularly that infamous structure that was on top.
Okay. I first became aware of Ladd's Mountain when I was doing an archaeological data recovery for Georgia Department of Transportation in the early 2000s, mid 2004, 2005, and 2006. We were excavating in advance of road construction of the highway where they're widening on the south side of the Etowah River, southwest of Cartersville. From the leak site, which is in the floodplain of the river, the prominent view is Ladd's Mountain. It's kind of a long ridge that snakes around on the north side of the Etowah, and on the northern end towards Cartersville, there's several important archaeological sites. There was on top, as you mentioned, there was a stone enclosure, a stone wall. It was first described and found in the historic record by a Smithsonian Institution archaeologist, researcher, Charles Whittlesey, in 1881. He recorded, he made a map of the site and notes of the site. Essentially, on the middle knob of the summit of the mountain, there was a stone wall that encircled the summit. It was said to be about 10 feet wide, 3 to 5 feet in height, and it was reported to have 6 openings. I don't know exactly how wide those openings are, but the top of the mountain is described as being kind of open with scattered trees, with a lot of rock, ledges, some chert. So this type of structure, is the site was given a name, Indian Fort, which is pretty common for those type of names for those type of features. Archaeologists don't think that was a fort, a defensive fort. Rather, we think that was an enclosure of space. It created a space that we think was used for more ceremonial, ritual purposes. Through research, we found that this type of site is very similar to other hilltop summit enclosures that were made at this time across the eastern woodlands. This fits a pattern you see up essentially through the Appalachians and in Ohio, particularly Ohio and Illinois. And archaeologists can relate this to a widespread cultural expression known as the Hopewellian interaction sphere. This was essentially a very widespread interaction network throughout the eastern woodlands, from Wisconsin all the way down to Florida and out to the plains, essentially. This is characterized by interaction at mound sites and at sites like you see on Ladd's Mountain, where essentially people who were participating in this network were traveling to these places across the country and helping to create them, essentially, like the leak site. They were building mounds, they were constructing enclosures, ditches, embankments. Up in the Midwest and Ohio area, they were creating geometric earthworks and octagons and circles and roads, things like that. And it was kind of done differently in the different areas. And down here in Cartersville, this became a major place, interaction center. Leak became a very important center in this expression over several hundred years. And I believe Ladd's Mountain was a very important factor in that development. Ladd's Mountain is, as he mentioned, a natural wonder. It had a vast cave in the northeastern side of it, unfortunately now mined away, but it was reported, some research has suggested it was as tall as 150 feet inside a vast cavern. Caves were very important in the cosmology and the belief system of Native Americans. They were essentially entrances and into the underworld, into the lower world. And you often find that they were used for more ceremonial, ritual purposes. Occasionally they would bury people in there. So for Ladd's Mountain in the cave, we also found that Smithsonian researchers visited and documented it in the late 1800s. John Rogan, who also is kind of well known for some of his work at the Etowah site early on, he recorded the site in the late 1800s, and he described it as the opening was walled up with very neatly, carefully stacked stones to almost make it hard to detect when it was first found. It became, as David will explain, the mountain became a mining location because it's essentially a large limestone deposit with all types of minerals that are valuable economically. So I believe, through my research with Leak and Ladd's Mountain, that this cave was likely a very important factor in the development of what was happening across the river of the Leak site as a major place for interaction and ceremony. So on top of this mountain, you have the stone enclosure, which again we think was more for ceremonial, ritual purposes. As when we go up on top of Ladd's Mountain, you can see down to Leak, to the floodplain. Perhaps they were signaling through mica sheets or fires, smoke, copper sheets down to Leak at certain times. The enclosure was unfortunately dismantled and removed in 1936 by the landowner who wanted to sell the rock to the county for road fill. So our research, David here, back in the mid-2000s, clued me into several historic photographs that were held at the Georgia State Archives. So I went and acquired those, and several of them show the mountain, and they show a road leading up to the top. And then there's also pictures of the, these are aerials. You can see them on the aerials, and then there's pictures of a National Park Service archaeologist who was there documenting the site. I believe, from what I can piece together, that he was probably notified of this, this dismantling before it happened by a local archaeologist named Pat Wofford, Pat Wofford Jr. maybe. He, and unfortunately I haven't been able to find many notes of his, or any notes or maps of his, but apparently he was an amateur archaeologist who lived in Cartersville, and he was talking with and notifying the well-known archaeologist about what was going on, or about the findings here in Cartersville. So about the same time, 1936, as they set up and dismantled this stone wall on top, they also did the same for a stone mound that was at the bottom of the mound, the bottom of the mountain. So there was a stone mound that was located near the entrance of the cave, on a little toe ridge at the bottom of the mountain, right adjacent to where the driveway into the operations center is now. It's no longer there. So the landowner, Mr. Shaw, at the time, set up a rock crusher there, and out of curiosity and to mine the rock to sell to the county for road fill, they dismantled it. Pat Wofford was there, and so we have some notes that description of what was happening from him that has been recorded. This mound was approximately 15 feet in height, covered with stones, had a depression in the center. It also was reported to have several small little stone mounds around, collections around its piles around its base, and possibly a trench. So when they set up the rock crusher and started dismantling it, Mr. Shaw, of course, the landowner, was there. They came upon, once they got down to the center of it, they came upon a skeleton, a burial. This burial had several grave goods in it that were that are diagnostic, similar to what we see found in other types of mounds throughout the eastern woodlands at this time, particularly in the Midwest and Ohio. These artifacts are are identical to what you see in those areas. So they include a large mica sheets that were placed over the face and the chest, several hammered sheet copper artifacts, including what archaeologists refer to as a breastplate that had 2 suspension holes in it, and it would have been over his chest or her chest. Several pieces of cut copper in geometric form, which again you see particularly up in the Ohio area, and then several stone celts or axes. And there's some suggestion that they found some pottery around the mound, but not inside. Mr. Shaw, who was not an archaeologist, and unprompted, said that it looked like the depression were rocks that would have caved down into a log tomb.
Right.
Because there was some thought, when you see things like that, a lot of people think, well, it's been taken apart before. People have been exploring it, looking for artifacts, and that's why it's like that. But no, this fits the pattern. He was right on, I believe. This fits the pattern you see in these Hopewellian mounds, where they were burying people within log tombs, which they would then cover with earth or stone, usually earth. So I believe this was a very important person who was buried in that. That essentially was I don't know if they were a liaison, but a leader of the leak site and the expression responsible for the mounds, the enclosure on the top, and the activities that leak. Unfortunately, we don't know where those artifacts went or the bones. I was able to track down one of the or a few of the copper artifacts through Lewis Larson, who was a former state archaeologist who resided in Cartersville. David told me about Lewis, letting him know that those artifacts should have been at West Georgia in the Waring Lab. I contacted them, and they were unable to find any, using all types of keywords that I provided them. They couldn't find them, so I contacted Lewis, and he told me that they should be in a Riker box in the special collection room, and I relayed that information to Waring, and sure enough, they found them. They at least found the copper artifacts, which were unlabeled, which was a major find. We haven't been able to find the other artifacts, but we're still trying.
Well, this is a good segue for a moment. We'll come back to this. I'd like to ask David and perhaps Carl, in addition to the Native American artifacts, could we jump back a little bit to the prehistoric times? I understand there were other finds that have been discovered in those caves before they were discovered. So, David, would you or Carl comment on those finds?
Carl, why don't you have it there?
Well, the only thing I know, based on what I've heard, is some of the animal remains that have been found there, such as what we refer to as a flat-faced cave bear. Is that correct? And saber-toothed tiger. That's about it. David probably can.
Well, they've got some of the things that came out of that cave at Tellus on display. But at some point in time, and I want to say in the 1950s, there was a group from Shorter College that as a class project, they went into the cave and retrieved a lot of very, very ancient remains of different types of animals, including the saber-toothed tiger. I think they actually found that, and then Tellus got it from them. But if you go to Tellus Science Museum, you can see some of the remains of to animals that were found in that cave.
But I think the saber-toothed tiger was really the find to discover that here in this region, that they used to perhaps occupy this territory. So, well,
Let me jump in real quick here. Archaeologically, John Rogan reported that he collected a couple of burials or specimens from human burials within it and sent that to the Smithsonian. I was unable to find if they have those or not when I did some research there years ago. So I'm not sure of the status of those. But that fits the pattern of burials within caves at this time. Other artifacts I don't know of in terms of human artifacts.
Well, let me pivot and come back to something sort of parallel that you were getting at. You and I recently have worked on, and with David's help, the fact that Bartow County was the hub of mound building here in Georgia, really, but certainly North Georgia. And the frequency of mounds that were here was impressive here in this county. About 30 we know of and documented, maybe others that haven't been discovered, which leads to, I think, the connection to Ladd's and the mountain, that this area had quite a religious impact even as early as the Native Americans, the Mississippian and beyond. To clear up a bit, that stone enclosure was not just a straight wall, it was an oval, as I understand it, several feet high. And some people think that it was a fort, and some people say that it was a ceremonial religious location, and others say it had to do with astronomy. So any further thinking about the religious impact with Leek, the relationship of the mountain and Leek and the religious connotations to those observations?
Sure. Archaeologists now think that a lot of what was happening during the Middle Woodland period, that when Leek was created and made, and when Ladd's Mountain sites were very likely created, were related to religious and cosmological expression. The enclosure of space and creation of sacred space by enclosing something is a universal phenomenon. And we see it, certainly see it here in the U.S. and in the eastern woodlands. There was not a village on top of that mountain, so there's nothing really to defend. I don't think it was a mundane site to defend. I think it was used much more for ceremonial purposes, and probably archaeoastronomy or astronomical observation, and I don't know what else. But there's no evidence that there was a village up there or anything like that. So we think, at Leak across the river at a large mound site, in the floodplain where people were coming and staying and living for however long. And again, this was a place where people from all over, from throughout the eastern woodlands were traveling. They were making pilgrimages.
Thank you for that word.
To these places. They were going to these places to be a part of this expression and to create these sites. Mounds, archaeologists know from Native Americans that mounds were not a practical feature. They were created for
Power, symbolism?
They were created for as expressions of renewal, world or fertility, for new eras. It wasn't really about power. These were a collective, from our evidence of middle woodland mound sites and villages and sites like these were collective, publicly available expressions, essentially.
David, you want to comment on anything regarding the...
I want to jump in here. I may be getting ahead of you, but I want to tell you when I first heard about the Leak Mounds. Of course, I grew up here, but after I had gone to college and gone to law school, I moved back in 1970. In 71 or 72, I don't remember why I was talking to Francis Adair, but I was speaking with Francis Adair about something. And Francis Adair was an old maid. She was probably in her 70s or 80s at that time. She lived on West Avenue, at the corner of West Avenue and Fight Street, and she was somewhat of a local character. She told me that about the stone enclosure and what happened to it. She told me that her father, who was a doctor here, had taken her up on top of Ladd's Mountain and shown her that stone enclosure when she was a little girl. That would have been in the early 1900s. And I said, well, I've never heard of it. What happened to it? And she said, John Dent got it. I said, what? And she said, he was the city manager of the city of Cartersville. And he contacted Frank Shaw, and who was the owner of the property, and negotiated to buy the stones and to have them crushed. And they paved West Avenue with that stone.
Yeah.
113.
113
all
west.
the way. Yeah.
Toward
yeah.
Montmartre.
So John Dent at that time was the mayor of Cartersville, and so I asked John Dent. He was real proud of it. He said he paid. He said he contacted Frank Shaw and he paid him a nickel a ton.
A nickel a ton.
And they built a road up the backside of Ladd's Mountain. They loaded it on dump trucks. They brought the stones to a crusher that was down at the bottom, but it wasn't the county that bought it, it was the city. I do think the county purchased the stones in 1940. The Shaw Mound that you referred to at the bottom, I believe Frank Shaw sold those stones to the county to pay something. I don't know what. So when you travel down West Avenue, going west, you're probably going over asphalt and then under that are stones that came from that stone enclosure.
We're riding over the top of Ladd's Mountain.
Yeah,
For quite a distance.
Yeah.
Well, I want to begin to transition, but we're going to come back to more of the history. Carl, you have any comment you want to make about the top of the mountain with the astronomical or yes?
I want to say one more thing in relation to that site. Also described, which I failed to mention, were several depressions at the opening of these gates, or at these openings. It makes me wonder, as an archaeologist, if they are essentially the rotted post holes from posts that were maybe formed gates or entrances, more formal entrances to these. I don't know, but as an archaeologist, I think maybe there's still some archaeological remains up there. That maybe those posts burned, and we could find carbon in those holes. I don't know that we could date. I don't know, but there's still some promise, even though it was removed, of seeing maybe finding some type of remnants of it.
Locating the footprint,
Right.
if we
right.
could. And again, probably an oval structure, several feet tall. And I'm wondering, do you have an opinion if those stones were loosely stacked or tightly stacked like a mason would do?
I want to say the description says loosely.
Okay.
I'd have to go back and see, but I don't believe that it was like very carefully stacked from the descriptions that I remember.
Right. Okay. Carl, any comment?
No, I mean, this man covered it all.
Okay. Well, we're going to come
He's a
back to
guru.
some history, so just sort of sit back and relax. And I want to transition now because this mountain is a storied mountain, quite honestly. It's got a number of pieces of history to it, but the next largest piece, I think, would be its mining history. And I want to turn to David for this. I have to begin with just a sort of a preamble to it. I grew up in the late 40s and 50s on Etowah Drive, and this will give you something to maybe spin off of. I can remember as a young boy in our backyard at Etowah Drive hearing the blasting that constantly was going on throughout the week. And you could actually look out across the tree line and see some of the, if you will, smoke or dust. And I would ask, what is going on over there? My father would say, well, that's Ladd's Mountain. They're blasting it down. They're tearing it up. They're getting the ore out of it. That's all I ever really knew as a young boy about the blasting. And also, right in front of it, while it was still operating, was something called Chain Gang Hill. And a lot of people thought that maybe those people worked over there, but I don't think that was the case. But with that said, David, I'd like to hear you tell us something about the history of Ladd Mountain operation and mining. Who owns it today, and how did it come about?
Well, let me start out. I've done some research on that topic. To my knowledge, the first mining operation at Ladd's Mountain was something called PECK, P-E-C-K,
Yep.
Lime Works. In 1872, Alonzo Ladd purchased that. And Alonzo Ladd never lived in Bartow County. He lived in Atlanta at the time he bought it, but he kind of an interesting character. He came from Ohio to Alabama in the late 1850s, and during the Civil War, he worked for the Confederate Nitrate Bureau, and he did cave explorations. He's going around, he's looking for things in caves that they can extract and make gunpowder out of it. That's what they're doing. And so he, after the Civil War, he was a lightning rod salesman. And he sold lightning rods all over Alabama. Then he moved to Atlanta, and he had a lightning rod company. Reminds me of Elmer Gantry, if you've ever seen
Yes.
that, because that's
Burt Lancaster.
he was a lightning rod salesman before he became a preacher. Well, Mr. Ladd was a lightning rod salesman before he became a miner. In 1872, he purchased the Ladd, what was Peck Lime Works, and it became Ladd Lime Works. And he mined it for several years. He died, I think, in 1893 in Las Vegas, Nevada, where he went because of some health problem he had. He went there for the dry climate. In 1880, there was a lawsuit filed against him, and a judgment was rendered against him, and his wife went to the Georgia Court of Appeals several times arguing about what had happened. A receiver was appointed. His wife sued the receiver that took ownership as a receiver of the lime works. Then I think the next ownership that I know of were three people, including, let me see here, two people from Rome, Henry Harvey and Wilson Hardy, and Billy Jackson of Cartersville. Now, those names should be familiar. One of the, let's see, Mr. Harvey's family, his daughter Ann married Dr. Sam Howell, so there was a connection there. He would have been the grandfather of Sammy Howell, who was also a doctor
Physician.
here. But the next ownership that I can find is, now they mined it for several years, but then a company called Rumford Baking Soda, and it was Rumford was a town in New Jersey, and they made baking soda and sold it nationally. They also mined a product, carbon dioxide, which puts the fizz in soft drinks. And so some people think that the products of Ladd's Mountain went into the original formula of Coca-Cola to put the fizz in it.
It's one of my questions.
Yeah, I've read that.
Dolomite, I think.
Yeah, yeah. With the connection that the Coca-Cola company had locally, I think that's probably
Smart.
probably true.
Yeah.
But Rumford Baking Powder Company, when they bought it, they primarily mined it for baking soda, and they sold it nationally. They are still a company in existence today. There was a man that moved here from Rumford, New Jersey, and he brought with him a man named Colonel William McNaughton. And William McNaughton actually was the manager of the mining operation there for Rumford Baking Soda, and I can't remember the guy's name. Raymond Hoagland was a descendant of the founders of Rumford Baking Soda. He came here and moved out on Burnt Hickory Road. The house is still standing. He and Colonel McNaughton were very close. Neither of them married, and they lived together, and I'll leave it at that. But what I heard growing up is when their operation closed, it was during the 1930s, and that Colonel McNaughton, oh, it was later than that, but whatever, the workers went on strike, and Colonel McNaughton went to work one day, and he always opened the gate, and the workers were out on strike. They wouldn't let him in. So he says, well, y'all let me in, and I'll go in the office, and then you can come in the office, and we'll talk about what your grievances are. So they let him in. He unlocked the gate. He went to his office. He got some cardboard boxes. He packed up all of his personal stuff. He put it in his car. He drove out. He locked the gate, and that was the end of that mining operation.
He scrammed.
And I understand that they were the largest employer in Bartow County when it was in operation.
My goodness.
And then after that, I think it was what the blasting that you and I heard growing up. I think the county acquired, maybe leased it, or and I think they used it for more for rock for road construction. And that's what you and I were hearing in the 40s when we were kids. And now a portion of that is owned by Bartow County on the south side. And on the north side, a portion of it is owned by the Jackson, Sonny Jackson and his family. I would imagine Sonny's son and widow now probably own it. But they have access to that area that is probably where the stone enclosure was. I think that's totally on their property, but I think the Shaw Mound at the bottom that you described, I think that's on property that's the county now.
I think that's private. It's right there by the line.
Oh, it is?
I think it was owned at one time. I'm not sure if it still is, by the Lewis, Earl Lewis, because when Scott and I were trying to get up to the top to take a look at the enclosure, we found
his
that back there.
descendants, his descendants own a large tract that backs up to it.
But I had contacted Earl prior to his passing to ask for permission to go up there, and he said, no, nobody goes up there, because he didn't want to set a precedence for that, to people to come back and visit and start probing around and that type of thing, and think if I allow one person to do it, I'm going to have to allow others to do it.
Well,
And the
several
same thing-
years ago, Scott asked me to see if I could contact some people that had ownership interest to get access to it, and no.
We've gotten
And the
nowhere
same
on
thing
this
with
request.
Sonny Jackson. I contacted Sonny. He and I were personal friends, and I talked to him, and he explained the situation to me, and I said, that's fine.
Well, I'll tell you, I have, Sonny Jackson's had built a cabin on the north side of it, and I went up there and met a group and did a lecture, a little talk on Ladd's Mountain. God, this was years ago, and you could see from that cabin piles of rock. You could see it. I mean, there's still some out.
Evidence.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think it's part of the stone closure. I think
No.
that's West Avenue.
Yeah.
But there's still some piles of rock, and it could be farmers piling rocks
Might
up
be.
or something. I don't know what it is, but it's an interesting history, and I enjoyed doing the research on it. Enjoyed telling you about it.
David, I want to back up to where we were talking about the blasting and explosions that we heard over there as I was growing up, certainly. I did some recent research about the tunnel mining history here in Bartow County. And in doing that research in some of the old newspapers, I discovered an issue in 1889 that described an unfortunate event on Ladd's Mountain. They were authorized to make nitroglycerin, and they had a 700-pound stockpile there, and they were continuing to make it on this particular day. And the gentleman that was working in the shed had just exited the shed to go somewhere else, fortunately, and the entire stockpile blew up. And it destroyed their equipment in the area. It blew the shack down, damaged an office building that they had. It was so severe that they had to cease operations for a number of days to rebuild things, but the unexpected result was that it had blown the windows out in all the houses in a 3-mile radius when they realized what kind of impact that had. So that blasting was a reality on Ladd's Mountain.
I did find an article, and I don't have that with me, and I don't remember what year it was, but there was an explosion that was related to the blasting with dynamite, where there were either 2 or I think there were 4 people that were killed because of a premature explosion of dynamite.
At Ladd's.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they were using both
Yeah.
nitroglycerin and dynamite.
Yeah, this article actually gave the names of the people that, well, I wish I had that with me, because some of the names were familiar local names that I think may have been
Right.
people that may have descendants that are still living in this area.
Well, I want to ask some pointed questions, and whoever can jump in on this regarding the operations, because I want to come back to some of the Native American history too. We've made the connection of the dolomite and Coca-Cola and the obvious reasons why, likely Asa Candler here. But if you look at that mountain, it's sheared off. It's almost a 90-degree drop from the edge. Would any of you know that was half of the mountain or a sloped mountain that was mined into? Was that cliff always there? Was it that sharp and steep and stark? How much of that was mined away? Anyone know?
I don't know. I've always wanted to find a map.
Yeah, I don't think anybody alive knows that. By the way, just to throw this in, before it was called Ladd's Mountain, it was called Hendricks Mountain.
Hendricks Mountain,
And,
thank you.
and then I was told years ago that back during the pre-Civil War period, it was called Three Sisters Mountain.
Because of the knobs. on
Yeah,
top.
and it was named after the rector at the Episcopal Church, whose name was Elliot. I don't remember his first name. He had 3 daughters, and they in honor of those 3 daughters, they called it Three Sisters Mountain.
Well, that mountain has had some interesting names. I also discovered, and you may comment on this, that before Ladd's bought it, they just simply called it Quarry's Mountain. Quarry Mountain.
I've read
seen
that too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have to wonder if there's not somewhere in the archives or files of some of these companies that have mined it. I have to wonder if there's not some maps and of it. I don't know that much about the mining process or pre-mining process, but I would imagine that they are creating maps of the places they're going to mine, detailed topographic maps. So I've often wondered if there's somewhere out there in some old archive somewhere
There have to be.
that would show that. But I would guess it would have been not just a straight cutoff. I would have guessed it would.
A gradual slope,
Yeah.
I think, and they mined
But
into
yeah,
that.
I don't know though.
Well, David, do you know how many kilns were there in operation?
No, but I've got a photograph.
All right, while you look for that, I think there were kilns there, but I never knew myself how many there were. How about the products that was produced by Ladd's manufacturing? They produced several, that I know of 2 or 3 of them, but do you know, David, what they produced?
Yeah, actually, I don't know it, but I've got something written about it where somebody else talked about it. If I can flip through these notes and find it.
But they had a rail shipping spur that went out to it, and they would load their product.
Yeah, pass that down. I don't know if you can pick that up, if it's a good enough picture. Okay, here we go. Ladd's Quarry. This is something prepared by the executive director of TELUS,
Okay.
Jose. Mining. Ladd's Quarry was mined for dolomitic limestone, referred to as dolomite. The rock produced raw material for lime, cement, and sodium bicarbonate, or baking soda. It was also used to extract carbon dioxide, CO2, gas for uses such as carbonation in soft drinks. This means CO2 from Ladd's Quarry was used to put the fizz in Coca-Cola.
Correct.
I want to say that there's other materials they were mining too, right?
Well,
I want to say I've seen a list somewhere.
I have various fertilizers, plaster, cement, and alabaster
Yeah,
are the ones that I've known about.
yeah. I did see alabaster written somewhere, but I have no idea what alabaster is.
I think it's
It's a kind of a hard stone, isn't
yeah,
it?
it's a
Somewhat like
slab.
marble
It's somewhat like marble, a slab of stone that could be used for construction, decorative.
and sculpture.
Absolutely. Well, I want to circle back to sort of reach our conclusion point, but I want to touch on the relationship from Etowah to Leak to the mountain. We didn't really talk about Etowah to that. Could you kind of sum that up?
Sure. Well, Leak itself, which archaeologists often place within the Middle Woodland period, we know was occupied from about 300 BC until around 650 AD. So several centuries. We think early on it was, a smaller local occupation, but pretty quickly by, I don't know, AD 1 or so and thereafter grew substantially and became very well-known, popular place within this regional network. So we know that it was abandoned by 650 AD through the archaeology. It's, of course, it's sitting in the bend of the Etowah River. Now, a couple miles upstream from there, 3 miles or so upstream, are the Etowah Mounds. Etowah, I believe, was first occupied around 900 AD. Is that right? I think around in there.
700, 700.
So probably a couple hundred years or so after Leek was abandoned. Through my research, I have found there's some similarities between Leek and Etowah. Of course, both have mounds. Leek didn't have as many mounds as Etowah, but there were 3 known, maybe 4 at Leek. But one of the features we found that we didn't know about when we did the data recovery there in 2005 was a vast ditch that essentially enclosed a portion of the site, and if it was was configured like the Etowah ditch. The Etowah ditch is now, you can see it's open, right? You can see its course. We believe that this ditch at Leek was filled in through flooding over centuries. But we also believe that it was likely open, or I feel it was probably open on either end, and it would have situated 2 of the mounds at Leek on an island. It would have created an island in that bend. And again, this comes back to enclosing sacred space, creating sacred space. So you see that similarity. I feel it's very likely that that Etowah followed somewhat of that footprint, but was located elsewhere, just up the river. We know that at least in historic times, Native Americans would often move their village along a river, and it maintained the same name. It was considered the same town. I have to wonder if Etowah was not kind of continuing that tradition later on. I have found a few interesting alignments between the sites that I haven't really done enough to really speak much about, but I'm kind of working on that in terms of astronomical alignments and direct alignments with Ladd's Mountain and the largest mound at Etowah. So there's we don't know what was going on exactly in the valley for a couple hundred years, maybe 300 years between Leek and Etowah. There hasn't been enough work done, and there's not enough sites from that period to really know exactly what was going on. But again, I think it very likely that Etowah was situated there with factors in mind related to Leek.
So you used an interesting word earlier, that being pilgrimages. So was the destination Etowah or Ladd's at the top, or Leek, or many other villages north of here from other states coming here for what and where?
So during the Middle Woodland period, when Leek was occupied, people would have come to the site itself.
The Ladd site.
To Leek.
To Leek site.
Which is essentially, it's just across the river.
Yeah.
I wonder if there were, pilgrimages from Leek to Ladd's. I mean, certainly, there was a connection, and people were going. I don't know exactly the nature of travel from Leek to the top of the mountain or to the cave or Shaw Mound, But there's some suggestion that people that very likely were going to the cave itself and going inside of the cave for whatever purposes.
Experience.
Yeah, for the experience, and maybe for whatever rituals, ceremonies. But these were public. People, just like one can go and join a church. We think this was an open expression that people could come to, and we know we find artifacts at Leek. We found artifacts from Leek from Ohio, chert blades that were from Flint Ridge, Ohio, a very unique looking type of flint, rainbow colored. We have 7 of those from Leek. Those are a diagnostic, very important item at that time that you find at these major centers. We found one of the major findings from Leek was an artifact. So there's a type of pottery made in this area and then found at Leek called Swift Creek pottery. Very ornate decorations on the outside of the vessel. Very distinctive. And we learned of a similar mound site up in Indiana called the Man Site that had a major Swift Creek pottery collection, which is not a pottery type from that area.
So it
at
was
all.
trade.
So yeah, and this has been known about people up in Indiana who've been working on that site it's been known since the 30s or before. Had always remarked on this pottery. And so we went up there during that investigation to look at that pottery and just to confirm it was Swift Creek. And it is, but it's made on the local clay up there. The designs are the same as you find down here, similar to what you find down here, but it's being made up there at that site. At the same time, you find another type of pottery, what you call simple stamp, which is not as ornate as just essentially lines on the outside of the vessel, considered more of a utilitarian everyday pottery. That's made of sand, with sand tempering, like you find down here. It's the same stuff you would find at the Leek site or anywhere around here. Same feel. So I came back from that trip. I started looking through the Leek collection, and I found a sherd, a rim sherd from a Swift Creek vessel that I knew immediately had been made up at Man because of the pace, of the feel, and the look. So I submitted that for what we call petrographic ceramic analysis. So a specialist essentially cuts through it and analyzes the mineralogy of it and compares it. Well, sure enough, and I didn't tell him I thought this was from Man. I included in a sample of 140 other sherds. And sure enough, he came back with his results and said, this is made at the Man site or in that area. So we have a direct artifactual connection between a major Hopewellian mound site up in Indiana, which is right on the river leading to the Ohio Hopewell area, and the Leek site. So we know there was interaction between physical and human interaction between these places. Perhaps it was a group of Swift Creek people who had moved up there to kind of proselytize their beliefs and share their ritual media.
Missionary work.
Right, perhaps. You find that pottery, it's been found in very, very small amounts at several of the major Hopewell mound sites in Ohio as well. So from that we learned that petrographer who did that analysis wrote a book a few years ago looking at all of middle woodland pottery throughout the eastern woodlands that he had studied from these type of sites. And he came to the conclusion that Leek was a major exporter of the simple stamp pottery, like I was talking about. They found it at least 31 sites across the eastern woodlands. So essentially, coming out of the major interpretation of Leek, or my personal interpretation of Leek, was that because of its location, because of the mineralogy here, the geology. They were collecting these type of minerals and making artifacts out of mica, out of graphite, out of hematite, out of, they loved quartz crystals, copper, all these type of materials, and a number of those are available here. Many of those are available here. They may have been mining out of that mountain too, out of the cave, I don't know, but it's possible. We found a number of crinoids, which are a fossil that you could probably find in the deposits at Ladd's. They, we figured out they actually made a type of pottery using those crinoids. You remember that? Mm-hmm. But essentially, Leek developed into a major center because of one, where it's located, you know, right here, right where we are, and I think this relates to Etowah too. We're essentially at the interface of several major river systems. We're at the interface between the Midwest and the southeastern area. So the Chattahoochee River, the Flint River, both come up to Atlanta area. The Ocmulgee River comes up to Atlanta area. The Ocmulgee offers access to the Atlantic. Mm-hmm. The Chattahoochee, of course, to the Gulf Coast. And then you have the Etowah River. And it flows westerly and then to the southwest to the Gulf Coast as well. Just north of here, not far, is the Tennessee River Valley. So essentially, we're at the interface that bridges the gap between the Southeast and the Midwest. And I think that's a major reason why Leek developed into a place. And I think essentially Etowah kind of followed that. Etowah's a major interregional, just like Leek, interregional place. And I don't know near as much about Etowah as I do Leek, or exactly what was going on there. But my understanding from Adam King and other other people who are working there, they're focused more and more on the religious aspect of this site. Yep. And you know, the artifacts, the deposits, the features, they all point. You know, people were certainly living there, but it wasn't an everyday village. These were sacred places at which, you know, people were building these mounds as part of their expression, and these places as part of their cosmological expression. And you know, there's more and more evidence that these sites are laid out according to to their cosmological principles. There's evidence that they're laid out according to astronomical alignments. Mm-hmm. We found that at Leek. Again, this is still, a lot of that research is still, hasn't been published yet, but, people are kind of piecing these things together. And again, it's more and more attention, for years, a lot of attention was paid more to the economy or trade aspects between these sites. But in the last 20 years, more archaeologists, and particularly as they work with tribes, have come to understand the religious aspects of this. And
Scott, thank you for such a grand description of what's going on at Ladd's, and all three of you for being here today. I think we had a lot to unpack, and there's much more that could be discussed. And we also want to thank you, Scott, for being our guide for the number of hikes that we've had up Ladd's Mountain, and we'll be doing more in the future. And we invite people who would like to join EVHS and participate in one of the hikes. David, do you have any closing remarks?
Just about the hike.
Well, whatever.
Well, several years ago, we lived down on Pumpkin Vine Creek, and I had a copperhead snake got in my screen porch. And so I called the county animal shelter, and they sent a guy out with one of these long rods where they get the snake.
Wrangle a snake.
Yeah. And he had a hard time finding it. It had crawled into a basket on my porch. So if he found the snake, he took it out and he opened up the back of his truck and he put the snake in there. I said, what do you do with those snakes? He said, well, we can't kill them. I said, well, what do you do with them? He said, we take them up on Ladd's Mountain and turn them loose.
That's nice to know.
The next name will be Copperhead Mountain.
So,
It will be.
so I just thought I'd tell you that.
Well, thank you for that warning. Carl, you have any closing remark?
No, I thought of several items I made notes on that I'm going to do some further research in, such as talking with Ann Cummings about an item or two. And a couple of years ago, I came across, it was either his daughter, I think it must be his granddaughter, but Pat Wofford Jr.'s, lives right here in town. She had contacted me about wanting to know if I would purchase some of his artifacts that he had collected over his
really?
lifetime. And of course, I went in and I tried, went into the thing again with her that we don't evaluate those artifacts. So I wouldn't know how much they were worth, how to tell her. I knew how much they were, but I didn't want to tell her. But anyway,
Does she have any notes?
I don't know if she's got any notes. I didn't even think of that at that time, but I've got me a note right here to try to see if I
Please
can
do.
locate her
Yeah.
again and go back and see if I can find out if she has any of Pat's
If we could
papers.
find Pat's, if those exist and we could find his materials, that would open up
You know
a
what?
lot of information, not just about Leak, but about a lot of sites.
Yeah.
My understanding is he was very active throughout the area.
He was, yeah. One more note about the Shaw Mound, and as you referred to it, the dismantling of the stones that Pat Wofford was there. But another person was there, Antonio Waring, for whom the lab is named at West Georgia. And he took extensive notes. I'm sure you've seen those. He published his papers, and I've got a copy of that. And he describes in detail when they took the rock and what they found, and had photographs in his paper. So he was a major influence. Wasn't he an amateur?
No. He was. He became. I don't know his exact history, but he became a professional.
Okay.
Pretty quickly.
Well, I've got a compilation of all of his papers, and they're kind of interesting.
I wish y'all
The
used-
wearing papers.
Yeah.
Yep.
I wish y'all would use the word avocational rather than amateur. Avocational sounds like it's got a little more importance to it.
Yeah.
Well, just for the record, as we close, can you cite where we think our artifacts have gotten off to for the record? I know that they're scattered all over various colleges and museums. Can you just quickly cite some of the locations that they're housed?
Well, you mentioned Peabody,
Yeah.
which has Etowah artifacts. From my research, I thought they may have Leak artifacts too, and I contacted them a number of years ago, and they said they didn't have any, so I don't know. But there's a large collection. The collection we've recovered during the data recovery in the mid-2000s is at Waring Lab, associated with University of West Georgia. There's a collection of Leak artifacts at University of Georgia from David Holly's field schools there in the late 1980s. Where else might they be?
Smithsonian.
Yep, at the Smithsonian they have a number of items from Rogan, and I can't remember who else.
And then Lewis Larson told me, who was a state archaeologist at one time, that they had some at Carlos Museum at Emory University, but I went there and they didn't know what I was talking about.
That's Etowah or Leak?
Etowah.
Okay.
And I think there are two other colleges in the northern states that Jim Langford knows about that has some, but I can't think of them off the top of my head.
From Etowah.
From Etowah, right.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if they're kind of scattered around.
They're
different
scattered
places.
around. Well, this has been fantastic. As I said, we had a lot to unpack today, and we have more if we had the time. But thank you, gentlemen, for all being here and for making this a document for us to be able to look back to and putting on an oral history. And we thank the Oral History Committee for making this possible. So we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Jeff.